Ladies and gentlemen, intersex and unisex, posthumans and prehumans, welcome to the Integral Stages Author Series. I'm your technically literate host, Layman Pascal, and today we're sitting down with meta-modern maven Brendan Graham Dempsey to explore themes in the recently published second volume of his project to track the evolutionary and sacred dynamics of universal learning processes. Volume 2 is called The Bee's Knees, an erotic adventure of the time of James I. No, sorry, I'm being told it's called Psyche and Symbolic Learning, and it picks up on the cosmological story of the unfolding stack of basic regimes like matter and life that characterized the first volume, and moves from there into the symbolic universe of psychological individuals and societies as an extension of the same basic processes of complexity, decentration, reflexivity, and viability that have governed the story so far. So if you love words you barely understand, you're in for a real treat with a guy who is establishing himself as one of our most informed and most integrative voices on developmental dynamics. Welcome, Notorious BGD.
Wow, thank you very much. That was great. I don't know who gave you the working title of the book, but that should never have leaked.
I had a palimpsest copy.
Okay. No, thank you. That was a lovely introduction and a lovely synopsis summary of the mission and goal of the book and its scope. So thank you for that.
Yeah, well, maybe you could say a few words to what the series is and where this volume leaps off and extrudes from the previous one.
Sure. So this is a work called The Evolution of Meaning, and I'm releasing it serially. I'm writing it and publishing it serially as sort of books, but I'm really thinking about it as one big book called The Evolution of Meaning, with each of these little volumes that I'm publishing as basically chapters in this big work. So eventually this will probably be a 10 to 12 volume work. Its scope is essentially to track, as the title suggests, how meaning itself has evolved and complexified across cosmic evolution. So to kind of unpack that, the first volume sets the stage for this inquiry and kind of takes the big picture overview to this and says, all right, well, what is meaning? And so it offers kind of a definition of what I'm using for understanding what meaning is and how it operates, and that's rooted in information theory and far from equilibrium thermodynamics and this sort of thing. But I'm drawing on complexity science, and I'm trying to use an understanding of what meaning is at a really kind of first principles level, and then track that basically from its earliest emergence all the way up to us right now, today, talking and making meaning and doing the whole human thing. Volume 1, after situating what meaning means, then looks at how that unfolds across cosmic evolution and draws on some meta-theoretical maps, most prominently Greg Enriquez's Unified Theory of Knowledge, or UTOK map, which tracks through a kind of complexity stack leading from matter to life to mind to culture, and recognizes that these are sort of unique information processing regimes. And my kind of contribution to that is, well, that means that these are also unique domains in which meaning gets processed as a kind of information across these different levels of complexity. And if that's the case, then we can get a sense that there's a deep continuity of how meaning has been operating from us to rocks. And I try to, in that first volume, sort of track that. And we could talk more about that in detail. But as you said, this volume then is the next volume in the series. So after laying out that big map, matter, life, mind, culture, and meaning at these different levels and different kind of information processing regimes, I zoom in on the last one, which is culture. And that is where symbolic information gets processed for meaning. And this puts us in the whole realm of basically cultural evolution, the development of meaning at the individual and collective levels, our justification systems or meta memes or worldviews, and different ways that we understand ultimate reality and ultimate concern. And the goal for the major part of the rest of this book series is going to be first to establish a relationship then between individual and collective meaning making. And then once we have a sense of that, I'm going to go through each of these meta memes or worldviews or meaning structures in great detail with a volume sort of a piece for each of these, before finally concluding with some general kind of reflective overview thoughts about this whole process and its meaning, the meaning of all this meaning making, and so on and so forth. So that's kind of the vision for the whole project. across the 10 volumes. This is volume number 2, and we're just kind of getting started then with looking at individual human meaning making that uses information processing at the symbolic level.
I use very often a kind of shorthand method of thinking about where the historical emergence of different regimes go for organisms. I think about sentient beings and sapient beings that have this sort of culturally enacted personhood, and also a little bit of an in-between stage that I associate with an expanded notion of the mirror phase in psychology and the nervous system's ability to map an individual body somehow. But I'm curious, having looked at this really closely, where you think the psyche or the symbolic or the cultural being begins. Like how does it suture to the biological being?
Yeah, and I think this is actually why the UTOC model is really great. I think this is one of its chief contributions to the big picture and big history sets of models that we've got, because it plugs in something really crucial there, which the UTOC model calls mind. So between life and between culture, you have this mind layer. And what's essentially happening there is at life, you obviously get cells and biological evolution at that level, which then form various kinds of multicellularity and more complex forms still at the life level. But when certain kinds of cellularity, let's say, sync up in a way that generates neuronal information processing as sort of sensory inputs into a given entity, that's where you get basically the emergence of minded animals. So this happens, it's thought, probably around 530 million years ago with the Cambrian explosion. And you've got this sort of moving out of the kind of single-celled or kind of let's just say, kind of the biological colony kind of configuration there. You start to see the emergence of complex active bodies that are able to navigate 3D space and move around. And these actually, as you know, it's called the Cambrian explosion because we just see this wild proliferation of all these diverse forms around this period. Some people, I think the best idea out there is that this happened because of predator-prey relationships, that basically we move from photosynthesis to some, uppity cell gets the idea, hey, I can eat my neighbor, and then I can just sort of munch off of all the photosynthesis he's done and take it easy. And then that, of course, then requires that these cells get a little bit more keen to what's going on around them, who's tracking them, who's gonna crunch on them, and then you start needing the capacity to move around 3D space more sentiently. And so that kind of changes the behavioral dynamics, and you see this evolutionary pressure that leads to this ratcheting kind of complexity of the sort of animal body plane. And from there are interesting things that show up because early kind of versions of this are still basically reflex driven. So you've still got these kind of biologically inherited behavioral patterns that, like, just as, for example, when a cell navigates towards a toxin, it'll kind of chemically react in such a way as to move away from it, and vice versa. When it comes towards nutrients like sugar, it'll move towards. That's called chemotaxis. And these are kind of just basic reflex patterns. It's not probably like the cell is thinking, ooh, there's some tasty sugar over here, let me go over here, and oh no, it's just basically a kind of gradient on the cell membrane has a chemical impact that causes it to move in a particular direction. And this kind of still is the case, it seems, in early forms of like the minded animal domain, where you start getting these little critters moving around, the kind of bug-like critters and stuff, that there's probably still largely just reflex driven activity, or what Ginsberg and Jablonka in their book The Evolution of the Sensitive Soul called associative learning. And what happens, though, is that eventually you get a number of these kind of sensory inputs and these mechanisms that kind of sync up, and you get the evolution of a sort of shared value currency. So if you want to think about your own senses, you've got ears, you've got a nose, you've got a mouth, and there's kind of a good for and a bad for that all of those are registering. Like you could hear a really loud, sharp pitch, or you could, taste something that feels really, tastes really acrid or something, whatever. We have these sort of different sensory apparatuses that are giving us different kinds of input relative to, our viability and whether or not this is good for us or bad for us. Well, at a certain point, these kind of sync up in early minded animals into a kind of shared, distributed, coherent kind of signal that's sort of being processed in a kind of integrated way. And it's thought that this is sort of the basal emergence of something like what we would call the sentience thing, the kind of awareness, the subjectivity, the feeling like a thing. And so as that unfolds and develops, then you start getting more and more complex versions of that. The nervous system itself winds up developing, brains and encephalization processes develop, and so you wind up seeing much more complicated and complex nervous systems that are generating much more complex sensory inputs that then are leading to much more complex and deep, you could say, conscious experiences. And so something like integrated information theory is a good kind of map for this, of seeing how that unfolds. And so that's kind of where you get minded animals that are feeling, they have emotion, they've got complex inner states. And as you get into sort of the higher primates and things, you've got complex social relationships. So you've got social emotions. You've got elephants that, you know, mourn their dead, and dolphins who have, you know, social relationships, and the great apes, etc. And these are powerful internal conscious states. But what you don't have yet is language. And so that's sort of that last layer for now that's led to this additional emergence of from moving from minded animals into culture, where you start having the ability to then use a medium of symbolic information processing to communicate to conspecifics and to basically reflect on your own internal processing. So you become self-conscious of your own conscious state. And that's where that layer is. So it's a really, I think, it's a very elegant system for understanding these crucial junctures in kind of the evolution of consciousness and the movement from sort of a reflex-driven, unconscious, or at least, you know, again, if you want to take and try to bring in certain kinds of panpsychic views, very minimally conscious in some sort of way, to this explosion of consciousness that emerges with unassociated unlimited associative learning, as it's called, and you get the conscious explosion, and then you layer that with a level of reflective language use, and you get, voila, a human being. So those would be the points that I would lay out, and that's, you know, I think a very helpful model that the UTalk framework gives us for that question.
This thing we call consciousness seems to be pretty closely correlated to the production of a generalized information processing, right? That really, you were talking about a currency share between the different senses and integrated information theory and things like that. It seems to me that, roughly speaking, there's an increase of generalized intelligence, generalized subjective capacity at each of these steps. And I'm curious, you know, you've looked as closely at a lot of these theorists and structures as anybody has, whether you're leaning in the direction that this generalized capacity we're calling consciousness is the production of a new thing, or the revealing of an underlying element of the universe that was always there.
Yeah, I mean, this is the big question. I think it's a really important question, and I've got a lot of thoughts about it. I would say, though, interestingly, to a degree, it doesn't matter. And I think that we actually kind of get tripped up around this because we think, oh, no, this is the most important thing if it's not this. But what I mean by it doesn't matter is I think whatever someone might mean about a basal consciousness to, let's just say, the universe, whatever they mean, they don't mean what we generally kind of colloquially mean by consciousness, of like, I'm having a conscious experience, I have feelings, I have emotions, right? There's a shared sense in, you know, I think pretty sophisticated people who use that framework, that to have that kind of conscious experience, you need a nervous system and you need all these things that we have. So if you take away symbolic information processing, you take away neuronal information processing, you take away genetic information processing, and you're just at the matter level, then clearly you don't have the layered, amplified, extended versions of whatever this basal consciousness is. So what do you have? And whatever it is seems like something very bare and sparse, you know, kind of mind dust, as people talk about it. And what's interesting about that is that, like, at a certain point, the question starts to kind of converge to a place where semantic understandings become, I think, more or less unhelpful, right? When I've talked to Matt Segal, for example, about prehension, the ways that I hear it described sound to me almost entirely objective rather than subjective. And so I think our language really trips us up here. And if we kind of follow the conscious trajectory all the way down, as it were, it seems like we get to something that's sort of so small that it's so minuscule. Whether or not we're going to say, well, let's just say that this shows up, at the first cell or the first minded body or something, versus that this goes down into atoms and molecules. It's kind of like it's a parsing at such a small level that, like, does that really matter? Now, I think metaphysically, for people to say that there's some element of mind going on, or what would you say, interiority that goes all the way down, I'm fine making that kind of view. I just think that what we tend to mean by that doesn't really become super relevant until you start seeing the emergence of life, and then minded animals, and then humans. And so, yeah, it sort of becomes a little bit of a distinction without a difference, I would argue. I like the idea that there's some kind of the way I'm increasingly tending to look at this is that once you get an entity in a field and that kind of basic dynamic, then you're going to have some kind of interiority and exteriority, because you've got basically some kind of Markov blanket or some kind of membrane that's separating the negative space between the thing and not the thing. And once you have that, there's something that's going on, like actually physically, like temporally, space-time wise, inside of that thing that's different from what's outside of it. And if we want to call that interiority, that maybe that's a really good place to start, because things are going to feel different. They're going to be operating different. They're going to have different kinds of sort of immediate goal and problem space kinds of, let's say, dynamics in that kind of internal constellation that are different from the external. And that's going to create driving dynamics probably that are going to compound and then lead to complexity. So when we're humans, we've got our interiority is our nervous system and it's our minds, and we're doing all this kind of really complex processing. You go down to animals, and maybe your dog has some really complex processing emotionally, not the self-conscious part and the linguistic justification part, but certainly strong emotions and all that going on. Lots of complexity in there. But, again, as you kind of trace that down, I think that maybe the kind of basal element of that is just a kind of, there's an inness and inwardness and inner element, and that has a kind of internal set of characteristics or dynamics, and that's compared to the external, and that's the kind of seed or germ that leads to the complexity that we see. I find that a compelling idea, and maybe just the last element I'll add to that is I'm okay also with some notion of like an urge or an appetition or a will. I mean, these start to sound a little bit too anthropomorphic or zoomorphic for my liking if you're talking just at matter, but there's something maybe going on at this kind of like for example, we know at the quantum foam level, things nothing's just still and quiet. It's like it's bubbling and sizzling, and the universe is dynamic and creative. Particles pop in and out of existence, right? So like if that's happening at like basically the Planck level, well, there's going to be lots of really interesting fizzling dynamic, creative juices that are going at like the molecule level. And if that's going on in the interior relative to the exterior, I think there's something there that then follows a problem space, a possibility space that tends to unfold in a particular way. So I have a lot more to say about that, but that's just the kind of basic angle I take with sort of this consciousness go all the way down thing.
Well, I'm sorry I asked. Yeah, I think there's very interesting considerations about the informational preconditions that are implied by the emergence of subjectivities, how those are tied together, and to what degree can a sort of external view of something like an informational or Markov boundary tell us what is or only what correlates to a subjectivity. But in general, I think, as you know, I really like the who cares argument, because I think we're trying to describe a structure that can be read equally as two faces of a vase. And that's a fundamental requirement. It has to be able to be read either way in order to do the job we need it to do as an explanation. However, that's not our focus today. I love what you've been doing in terms of trying to describe the overall movement between different information regimes as a kind of a learning engine.
Mm-hmm.
And as social beings, we have explicit learning conditions that we think of as education or something in that regime. So when you look at human socialized learning encouragements,
Mm,
but you do it in the context of a whole history of learning like processes coming down through the cosmos.
mm.
What does that tell us about how education should be? Are there conclusions about social education that we would derive from seeing it in this larger learning context?
Yeah, that's a great question. And let me just put out the important context there for what that story is, because that is that's what I'm trying to tell. So before getting to some of the implications for us, like, what are the dynamics? And so the kind of tale here is that, yes, the universe is an intelligence generation machine of some kind. And, Matt Segal or someone might get mad at me for using a machine metaphor. Call it a dynamic flower organism that's leading to, increased intelligence. But there's an intelligence function here that is increasing. And there seems to be, and I'll try to draw on different kinds of metaphorical styles to articulate this, but I think something like information processing and algorithms can be helpful here, because they give us a sense of sort of iterative, recursive kinds of mathematical, elegant kinds of looping systems that generate all this complexity. And so the basic idea is that once you have that entity in that field, that entity in its environment, and that kind of basic distinction, then there's going to be things that are, let's say, that enhance the viability of this entity relative to this environment. This creates a relationship that is not arbitrary. It's a set of constraints now that, for this thing to continue to be, it has to meet certain minimal constraints. If it's going to reproduce and continue to thrive and even flourish in whatever this environment is, that's an even additional set of constraints. And so the basic dynamic is one in which you've got entities operating in fields that there's an information linkage between the two, that a subset of that information is going to help with the flourishing and the complexity and the growth and the well-being of this entity and context. And then a bunch that is either kind of, let's just say, neutral to that or has no bearing on that, and some that is, of course, going to be deleterious to the entity. And so what learning is basically problem solving. It's operating in a given context in such a way that maintains and ultimately enhances the viability of that entity. And so when we look at fit in the evolutionary story, and we talk about the evolution of the fittest, it's not like, oh, I'm the most strong, or I'm super fit. That's an extension of the idea. But basic fit is more like a fit between a lock and a key, or a kind of pattern matching. Or if you look at the camouflage that like animals develop, of how they blend right in with their environment, there's a fit between, in that case, the organism and its environment. And that's intelligence. It is mutual information coupling that entity with its environment in a way that enhances its viability, at the very least maintains and preserves it. So that's the basic idea of learning. And that's how intelligence is sort of generated. And that's how knowledge about the world is accrued. And of course, there's a selection mechanism going on here. So, in kind of the classic Darwinian story of the peppered moths, right? You had all these brown moths floating around England, and then the Industrial Revolution comes, and then you get all the smoke and the ash and the soot that lands on the trees. And now the trees are gray, and so the brown moths are getting eaten, and the ones who just have more gray coloring wind up living. And so through a couple generations of that, you get the emergence then of a predominantly gray version of the moth rather than the brown one. And that is through a coupling or a fitting of that organism to its environment in a way that allows it to not be eaten, to continue to survive, to continue to be viable. And so that you could say is genetic learning, that information processing at the genetic level has allowed for that to occur. Now, the basic idea there is what also is behind our cognitive learning. So when we use our minds to navigate an environment, and you get the 3D action space of a body moving, at the minded animal level, we need to have behaviors that work in the same way, that maintain our viability, et cetera. And so the ones that work get retained, and the ones that don't work get thrown away. So even when a child is learning to walk, they try a million different things, and most of that they fail at, but then they finally hit on something that maybe allows them to stand. So this is a little bit of a progress. And then they use that to be the ratcheting thing that will allow them to take their first step, and so on and so forth. So it's an iterative process that's sort of building upon what's been successful, and basically selecting out what hasn't been successful. And if you iterate that a lot, you get a learning algorithm, you get a learning function. And that's been going on through evolution. I think even at the pre-evolutionary, or at least the Darwinian biological evolutionary level as well. And it happens at the learning level. And this leads us to then developmental psychology, because this is what Baldwin and Piaget were picking up on in the late 19th century, early 20th century, as saying like, oh, it's the same thing. Like this is how humans learn. And so Baldwin had these terms that he called habit and accommodation. And habit is basically you retain all those successful behaviors, and accommodation is having to adapt the ones that you've saved to try to meet new, different circumstances. And so through this process, you get this evolutionary development of knowledge for a human. And Baldwin wound up calling this accommodation and assimilation, but it's the same idea. So what's interesting is you have this evolutionary variation and selective retention pattern that algorithmically runs and then generates knowledge. So that's the dynamic. And then the question that you're asking is, all right, well, if we actually know that, and we can root our understanding of human learning in a deep evolutionary cosmic story of intelligence production, how could we more effectively actually generate learning conditions for human beings? These are the questions that we should be asking. Now, the specifics of that, I think you could start with metrics for one. I think anyone who's heard me talk about education knows that I'm a savage critic of our entire system. I think it's broken at so many levels I couldn't even begin to get into it. But you could, I don't know, just throw out a couple of suggestions here. One, what are you actually measuring when you're looking at human learning, right? Are you looking at some construct that was statistically derived from blah, 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 and doesn't really have a good foundational theoretical framework behind it, like IQ? Are you even using that proxy in a proxied way so that you're getting further away from whatever even that is? Or are you using something like hierarchical complexity, which is actually measuring the complexification rooted in the theory of how human learning works, right? So if we were to be using metrics like that, that's like the first step. And so we haven't even begun to do that, but folks at like institutes like Lectica, for example, have developed the metrics and the scales and the tools to be able to do this. They're putting out things that hopefully will be able to scale. If we could get these into the schools, everywhere from elementary all the way up to college, and have people actually tracking their own growth and development in terms of these metrics. And if teachers had that kind of information before them, that would be huge. So anyway, like, what do we measure? What are we looking for? How are we thinking about learning and growth? You actually have to have the right tools grounded in the right theories to do that. And we're not doing that at all right now. And just for the record, what we are doing is using standardized tests. That's a whole other rabbit hole I don't want to get into. But the point is, we're currently doing the very thing that you wouldn't want to do if you wanted to engender this kind of growth. So there's that. Another big thing I think is appreciating then all the variability that goes into human development, right? So we're currently operating in a very modern factory style standardization scheme, and we use age as like the categorization method to put people into grades. It's like, oh, you've gone another cycle around the sun, you must have learned a lot of things, we'll put you in the next group. And what we know from developmental psychology is that there's so many factors that influence where a person's kind of at in their developmental growth at any given moment, as measured by these kinds of metrics that actually are getting at that. And there's huge variability in age. So it doesn't make any sense to put a bunch of people together and learn a core curriculum where half the people aren't getting any of it. A quarter of the people are totally bored, and maybe some subset are like actually kind of on par with whatever. So actually recognizing that learning happens at these different levels and using those as the guidance rather than just age groupings would also be really huge, because then you're in your cohort of people that's actually at your zone of proximal development. You're actually learning from people. And I think there's a whole model here that we could begin to develop around a kind of almost kind of, I'm thinking of like Pseudo Dionysius, who's the guy who coined the idea of hierarchy, which I know is a kind of nasty term for some people. But the basic idea that he's getting at there is that if you read his works in his kind of religious order, there are people that are kind of your mentors, and then there are people that are sort of below you that you're mentoring. And just taking the term in that sense, right? If we were to think of education like that, like imagine you're in the 4th grade, but you're tutoring a 3rd grader and you're being tutored by a 5th grader, right? Then you've got at every level, someone is teaching and someone's learning, and everyone's sort of co-learning together. This is some ideas that I was exploring with a guy named Jonathan Robillard, who'd reached out to me about doing some work around what he calls festival-based learning, and that's a whole really cool thing he was developing. But something like that would certainly be a lot more generative for people's growth and development. So anyway, I'll leave it there. There's a whole conversation we could have around what would be the optimal conditions for human learning if we were to actually think reflectively about it based on the best science. And it looks nothing like what we're doing now, but it's a big concern of mine, going forward. So anyway, a conversation in more depth for another time.
That was very cogent. So whatever drugs you're on are working very well. Um, Now, I have a curiosity around how much we conflate symbolic intelligence with sort of typical notions of language, right? Because you might say we would expect there to be a left and a right brain version of symbolic processing and learning, but maybe we overweight the left brain one because it's easier to track. Then similar with things like Lectica and the lexical dictionary and all those interesting things that you explore really well in this book. They're devising metrics, but they're primarily using speech and text structures in order to derive those metrics. Are there things they're leaving out? Like, how do you hold the idea of additional realms of symbolic or symbolic equivalent processing that aren't falling into our logocentric assumptions about what constitutes symbolic consciousness?
Yeah, it's a lot that's being left out. I think what is being captured is very significant. And in my studies so far, in the research that I'm doing, and for people who are interested in this kind of thing, this book is jam-packed with like actual empirical research data. So if you're interested in this and not, this is something maybe we can talk about too, but like there's a very big difference between kind of just looking at charts and making your own charts and trying to line things up based on descriptions of people's work that's already happened versus like actually doing testing and experimentation and like actually saying, oh, well, maybe that doesn't fit there and this kind of thing. And I think that we collectively as a kind of movement, as a community of folks interested in these kinds of models should be doing a lot more of that kind of work because that's where things really get, I think, advanced. So yeah, I think something, as I was saying, that it seems to be coming out of the data that I've been finding is that a lot of the variance here is accounted for by this lexical hierarchical complexity scoring, but a decent percentage isn't. I mean, by social science standards, like a huge amount is, and it's actually kind of shocking. But I think still that remains. Then there's this other thing left over, and then it's like, well, what's that about? And it's early days yet, so that might be slightly overstating the case. But I found these findings, as one does, to be like very robust and really compelling and really validating in many ways. And so I wanted to say that. So then what is the leftover part? This, I think, is, again, something that we really should be asking amongst ourselves and really exploring deeply in the community, because there's so many things. And as I'm going through this data, I'm trying to get better answers about that. I like the left brain, right brain thing. I think something's going on there. There's something around a kind of gestalt or holistic intelligence that people can have that operates more at sort of a vibe, sensibility level, and less at sort of a logocentric idea level. How we relate those two, or more importantly, how do we measure that? Those are big questions, right? I think like something like the lectical scale gives us this incredible metric that we can use, but there are other variables we need to be looking at, and there are other measures that we need for those variables, and we don't have them. So one of the biggest ones I do think is something that comes from state and depth stuff. Like if you just want to think about like Hansi Freinacht's model, right? You've got code and complexity, and you've also got state and depth. Something like that. Similarly, Zach Stein, he has a metapsychology and he's got complexity, but he's also got transcendence and ensoulment. And so there are these other components besides the complexity part that are really important. And I think a lot of that can be influenced by state practice and the kinds of things that happen across the lifespan that kind of create deeper sensibilities of people. I can come back to that because another thing I want to hit on too is typology or temperamental differences. And here I think like the I've come to appreciate more and more some of those different elements of the integral model for what they're getting at, right? So it's not just altitude, it's also lines. Like that's basically dynamic skill theory. It's like there's complexity, but then there's also domains or different skills. But then there's also temperament or type. And these can be genetically determined. They can be, I'm thinking just of, or like the big five, what makes you more neurotic versus open, what kind of life conditions maybe tend to lead you to be more kind of reserved or closed or dogmatic versus more open to change. There's a huge X factor there. And I mean, one of the things I'd like to do is start to do correlation studies between, all right, what's the lectical score? Then what are these other metrics saying? And how can we sync these up? And are there more kind of holistic typological framings that we could use in syncing those up with development? So that's really big. Context, basically. So actually, I just yesterday it was working with this model I was calling like the 6 C's, and it's something like, well, there is complexity and there is code, but there's also contentment, I was calling it, because it's sort of like, what is your level of sort of material well-being? Because if you're living in like a war-torn situation and you're just striving to get your immediate needs met, that's going to have a big impact on your development, on your learning, and maybe some of the values that you're going to hold in your broader worldview. If you live with what Ronald Engelhardt calls, contexts that favor post-materialist values and favor self-expression, your survival needs are kind of taken care of. And there's a kind of Maslow's hierarchy thing going on there. And these things are all complexly interpenetrated in various ways because people in those situations might have more access to education. And so their complexity might also then tend to be higher and these kinds of things. I also was interested in calendar, right? So the kinds of things that go into someone's worldview are also profoundly going to be affected by the time that they live in. Again, Hansi uses the example of, I'm talking about Hansi Freinock, the meta-modern thinker guy here. He uses an example of Thomas Aquinas, who clearly brilliant guy, but he was working with a very traditional code in terms of a kind of, very old school kind of Christian Catholicism with angels and all this stuff. Well, that's the time he lived in, and that's what he had to work with. And so if you don't have even the options of other frameworks of worldview yet, because they haven't emerged out of the social, psychological situation of the time period, then that's also going to influence what kinds of meaning-making structures you wind up adopting. And then the last thing I just called contingency, because it's like there will always be these path-dependent, accidental error kind of aspects of like, well, I had this experience when I was 6 years old and it's really informed whatever. And maybe that was because you ate something really weird that night or because a spirit visited you. Who knows? Like things just set you on a path that are going to profoundly change your whole worldview. And maybe, despite the other variables and complexity and code and all these other things, you're going to hold on to that for whatever reason. Or trauma, for example, has set you up in a particular way. So there's a bunch of other variables, I guess, to the core of your question. And we shouldn't reduce this all to complexity. All I'm trying to do with my work around complexity is advance the complexity vector of this, because it is a vector. And up until now, we actually haven't had any quantitative data that could actually look at that and do the kinds of comparisons and at the kind of level of precision that we needed to do. And I don't think our meta-theoretical models are going to advance much if we don't take it out of this sort of current paradigm that it's in and wind up advancing the ball with more social scientific rigor.
Your mention of Thomas Aquinas was interesting to me because it brings up the notion of how strongly or loosely we think social paradigms are coupled to stage-like developments in the complexity of individual psychosocial symbolic beings, right? We have this story from some of the big meta theorists like Wilber who pair those things really closely. But there's also strong critique, which leads to the use of things like cultural codes and going, well, the cultural embedding doesn't necessarily reflect any developmental progress over history. It may represent only adaptation to different technosocial conditions. Now, I'm curious, you've looked really closely and you're thinking of moving this series in the direction of something like stages. I'm assuming for individuals and for societies in a more complex way. That's a contentious position. What's the question here? How valid is it in your view, to think of cultural codes as being analogous to something like the development of complexity stages within individual symbolic beings?
Yeah, it's a great question. It's kind of the big question. And I look at my work that I'm doing as a research program into that question. I have a hypothesis, but as I am finding more data and analyzing it, that is nuancing the story. And that's always kind of the delightful aim of social science, I suppose. My hypothesis right now, and one that is, I think, currently well supported by overall the data, is something a bit more complicated than the kind of more simplistic story. But that as a heuristic isn't wrong. It's just a very simplified version of it. And there are even more or less complex or nuanced versions of even that, how people will talk about it. Obviously Wilbur has always talked about orienting generalizations. And I think if we want to think about like that integral map of sort of, the concentric spheres transcending and including and all that, I think that's a lovely heuristic and orienting generalization. The thing about data is it's very particular. So then when you try to get a bunch of data and sort of test that, there are many ways in which that story is kind of validated and confirmed, but there's also a lot of outliers and there's a lot of mess and there's a lot of noise and this kind of thing. And so that's kind of what I'm trying to work with in understanding that question. It's really interesting because there's so many how would I want to say? It's almost like, like that map is kind of like a toy car. And you think, oh, yeah, okay, I know how the car works. But then you actually see a real car and you open the hood and you're like, oh my God, this has a lot more moving parts than I thought it had, right? It's something like that. Because when you get a syncing up in a complex way of all these different variables, you're going to find all these interesting back formations, feedback loops, cycles, negative and positive, all these kinds of things. And so, for example, if we just think of like cognitive development as a driver of worldviews, I think that basic idea holds true, right? But then you're trying to look at that at scale, and you're trying to get a lot of data, and you're trying to look at, all right, well, then how does the emergence of a new worldview itself wind up then getting sort of fed back into the existing system, downward assimilated, or as often or I should say, as also happens, can be kind of upward interpreted. So I have data in my data sets of, people operating at very advanced metasystematic cognition, but they've got a very traditionalist worldview. And they're talking about, going in and saving, people for Christ in Africa and this sort of thing, in a sense of, a very kind of more traditional perspective. Now, what's interesting about that, though, is that these are also rare. So if you look at just sort of the statistics of all this, and you look at, well, how often does that really tend to be the case? It's relatively infrequent. So if you look at the general trend, it is the case that like cognitive complexity tends to pair pretty well with particular kinds of worldview structures and so on and so forth. But how do you make sense of these outliers? And then it brings up all the stuff we were just talking about. What other things are going on in that mix, that it's not just determined by complexity. There's all these other factors there. And similarly, like I've found folks in my data who they're talking about Teilhard de Chardin and evolutionary progression to higher states. And complexity-wise, it's kind of more in line with what you would tend to expect in sort of, kind of synthetic conformist or maybe like early reflective kinds of stages. So there are all these ways in which the content, once it's generated at a particular level, winds up getting fed back into the social system and metabolized at different levels of complexity. And all the complex permutations of how that can look and at the particular level are multifold. But does the general story hold true? I think it does. And that's what I'm trying to get at. And so one of the things I think we have to be very careful about is, like the quote always attributed to Einstein, make your models as simple as possible, but no simpler. I think the models are too simple when we're using something like a spiral dynamics color scheme and we're saying, you see this person's this, or whatever. I think there's a lot of understanding in the space around that kind of thing, but it still happens a lot. But I think even some of the more sophisticated ways are still missing a lot of important variables and complexity in the story. I think that we need to do what we can to clarify a lot of that. So I guess to answer your question, I am planning on this generally following the trajectory of a kind of stage-like model. But I want to do that in as rigorous a way as possible. And actually, and I should have said this maybe at the outset, but this was sort of the drive or the goal or the catalyzing mission for this project from the beginning. I mean, I'd written a book called Emergentism where I kind of offered an accessible, popular take on how I saw the whole big picture. But even when I was writing that, I'm like, I know that I need to write something that's 10 times as long and gets into all the details with all the footnotes and all the up-to-date science and all that. And that's what this project is. So I feel like what we currently don't have in the scene is something that does that. And by the scene, I guess I'd extend that to the movement, to the worldview, right? Like Wilber's Sex, Ecology, Spirituality is great, but actually, if you read it, there's not a whole lot of like facts and anthropological specifics that are in there, right? It makes these orienting generalizations, and I think that there's a lot of basis to them. But like what I want to do is not just say, and then there's a magental tribal structure, and then there's an agrarian, kind of red or amber structure, whatever. I want to say, all right, let's look at let's look at as much as I can get my hands on and reasonably engage with in the time frame of writing another book. Let's look at a whole bunch of anthropological data about hunter-gatherer societies. Let's actually go to the best scholars in this field and see what they're actually saying about forager societies and the values that exist in those societies. Let's look at specific tribes. Let's name them by name. Let's, I'll do all that, right? And not just have this sort of amorphous, tribal society, right? It's like, well, what are the complexities of tribal societies? And what are the distinctions and gradations? And are there interesting things that come out from that? Let's engage with the Graeber-Wengrow kind of stuff and throw that in and try to actually interpret what they're talking about, but not just abandon entirely developmental stage models either. So, that's a whole book, right? And so rather than just give this quick treatment of like whatever, a particular stage or worldview in a couple of sentences, like what's the data? That's what I want to do with this series. And so the reason why the integral model in particular was very compelling to me when I found it was because I'd had a background in classics. I'd studied ancient civilizations. I'd obviously studied a lot of biblical history and the Bible and Christianity and religions and all this stuff. And when I found these maps, they made a lot of sense according to the heuristic gestalts that I'd kind of had in my own head around some of these things, but weren't really well supplemented with any of the kind of rich apparatus of facts to kind of let them land. And until we do that, I think that a lot of this is going to hang out in conjectural, speculative, sociological theorizing space, and it's not going to be taken seriously by the academy, by the institutions, by the broader knowledge society that I think these things need uptake in. And so, yeah, that's the goal of this book is like, all right, if there's a magenta structure, what do we mean by that quantitatively in terms of any potential developmental metrics we could be using on this issue? What does the actual anthropological literature say? What's the debate around animism and this and that? And really just get into it. And I'm just using that as an example, but all the way up into agrarian and then industrial civilization to post-industrial, postmodern civilization, and then grapple with these questions and kind of spend a couple of hundred pages on each one of these. So anyway, to bring it back to your question, yes, I'm taking that broad arc view. That's my working hypothesis. But along the way, I want to continually revise, nuance, update that model so that we've got something we can actually really work with in the most robust way.
That's an exciting project. I think, Wilbur had a really good instinct for fleshing out some of the basic chunks that would be needed to establish a post-relativistic developmental consensus. But like you say, there's a lot of speculative vagueness in all of that, and a bunch of it has been reconsolidated around this sort of Vervaeke Henriquez discussion. But the main thing they don't have that Wilbur has really tried to clarify is this developmental stage thing and how that works. So I think a lot of people are waiting for a richer dive into those components in a way that couples more tightly to the contemporary, state of the art of scientific consensus.
Well, and I would say that
this book in particular, I think, like the way I read it, is the bridge to that.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, no, totally. That's a great kind of, summary of what, in a sense, the project is, because the Vervaeke Henriquez, synthesis that they're doing around relevance realization and meaning making in a big picture, or big history kind of context, that is sort of the dynamics. But then I'm trying to, yes, bring in that kind of developmental emphasis and the anthropological, sociological emphasis with detail to kind of fill in that whole story and bridge those. So it is essentially a synthesis of Vervaeke, Henriquez, Wilber, Bobby Azarian, Tyler Volk, so on and so forth, and other meta-theoretical thinkers, Habermas, and so on and so forth, and trying to actively and explicitly engage those thinkers to present a kind of whole big picture take on all of that. But yeah, that's exactly it.
One of the things I really liked about the book is a sort of a history of thinkers who've thought about the relationship between knowledge and reality, and that leads toward a story of the thinkers who set you up to move the academic project of developmentalism forward. Delightful to read your dives and your takes into those different thinkers and how you position them relative to each other. Who do you think is not appreciated nearly enough in the story of the development of learning, complexity, and development?
Well, I mean, most immediately, well, gosh, I would say in practice in the broader community, I think Kurt Fischer and his dynamic skill theory model is overlooked. I think it's the best model if we're looking for a go-to kind of general model of cognitive development. He's a neo-Piagetian thinker. That's what Lectica is basing its sort of general framework on. And he, to me, represents, and dynamic skill theory represents the best accounting for all of that. And those who were attentive to the debate that raged, I don't know, at this point, a couple of years ago now, between Nora Bateson and the community and stage theories are BS and all this stuff, almost all of her critiques had already been accounted for by these neo-Piagetian thinkers, Kurt Fischer probably best of all. So the dynamic variability, down the line, it's sort of like, yes, this stuff has been well known about. The critiques of Piaget are over, half a century old at this point. It's not like everything ended with Piaget. So I think people just haven't really encountered that literature. And that's the goal for this specific book. I've talked about the goal of the project. The goal of this specific book is basically as a primer, as a survey, an overview, an introduction to the field of developmental psychology and its current state of the art. So if someone's looking for a go-to place to learn about all this, and they keep seeing things pop up from the spiral dynamics integral folks of doing a cool session on Kohlberg, who's that, or Piaget, yeah, or whatever. They've read the integral books and like, oh, there's clearly a lot of stuff here. Well, if you actually want to go to the source, well, secondary source, I guess, kind of obviously I'm trying to synthesize this stuff and put it out there. A big thing I'm trying to do is present actual information from these people in the text, right? And again, it's not a critique, but Wilber doesn't do that so much. That's not entirely true. If you look at Sex, Ecology, Spirituality, he does quote a lot from the essential Piaget. But in terms of engaging with these various scholars and tracking that development of developmental psychology, that's what this book is largely trying to do and get people up to date on that. Because I think even in the developmental community itself, there's surprising kind of lack of literacy with basically everything after 1985. It's sort of like, and as people are getting things secondhand from Wilber, a lot of which was written in the late 90s and early 2000s, they're just not getting the newer stuff that's been going on over the past 40 years. Really. And so I want to go through that in this book and offer an overview of that. But yeah, I would say Kurt Fischer's huge. Dynamic skill theory is huge. And if you get into that, then it resolves a lot of these issues that people have raised. I could point to James Mark Baldwin, who has a really interesting story about kind of getting, intentionally sort of removed from the history of developmental psychology. But his ideas, I think, are really compelling and whatnot, but I don't personally kind of use too much of him. But there's an interesting story there for how, most people looked at Piaget, and a lot of what Piaget is doing is already, just kind of recapitulating what Baldwin was doing. Of course, there's also Theo Dawson and what she's done to advance even dynamic skill theory. I think what Lectica is doing is the cutting edge, is the state of the art. I do obviously have to fall, I guess, on certain claims or commitments in a work like this. I can't just say, well, all these models are equally valid or equally good, or all these metrics are equally sound. Like, I think Lectica's is really sound and really good, and then I kind of use that as the benchmark for these others, and there's a reason for that. So I think again, yeah, if people are looking for what isn't really talked about enough or engaged with enough. It's trying to use the lectical scale and what Lectica has been doing to advance these things. Yeah, I mean, there's a lot of other people, kind of philosophical
No,
thinkers I
that's
might
great.
mention,
That's
but yeah.
great. And I hear a lot of excitement in you for this book being, the introduction you wished you had.
Mm, yeah. Yeah, I think that's right. I think again, I mean, it's been a delightful journey for me to ever since, reading sex psychology, spirituality, and then like getting introduced to a bunch of ideas that then I wanted to follow up on and read the original sources for and go deep into. That's been what I've been doing over the past however many years. And this is kind of a distillation of that effort of mine to kind of, I mean, when I say this, I mean the whole series is like I'm trying to follow the threads of all of this stuff really deep and into the present and try to present that in a digestible, hopefully relatively accessible way for a broader audience while staying really true to like, here's a quote from this person and they actually said this, and this person said this, and give people, a share of that. That's a big goal of this book. And that'll become more important as we move into the actual descriptions for these volumes of the different worldview structures and meaning making structures, because, it's one thing to say something in a generic kind of stereotypical sense about traditional mythic religion or something. It's another thing to go through the actual source text or to talk about the axial age and say, there's a change into transcendence. But like, that section in Plato where he's actually talking about how Homer, gets the gods wrong and, actually quoting that and then scoring that for complexity and seeing how that's actually higher than the original, all that stuff. Like, that's what I want to do with this. And yeah, I guess trying to say it as the introduction that I wished I might have gotten from this is a nice way of putting that.
I know you're not the biggest fan of Eurotrash psychoanalyst Jacques Lacan, but one of the things I think Lacan was trying to do, particularly later in life, was lay out a sense of the architecture of the subjectivity of one who has been entered into the symbolic operating system.
Mm.
And that what it takes to translate a being that has sentience into that system,
Mm.
and what it's like for them to be in that system as a kind of self-conflicted being that's moving around on a virtual game board, that's converted biological drive into something like desire and anxiety that can't be decoupled, and
Mm.
under the view of this imaginary reification of the controller of the game board that they call the big other, and then this divided entity is looking for this idealized other that it can merge with, but also the idealized other that tells it what it ought to be, and that each of the movements is constrained by sort of basic existential dichotomies. Like there has to be a difference between self and other. There has to be a difference between sameness and difference. There's these sort of fundamental parameters of what it's like to be inside the symbolic operating system. Now, whether he's correct or not, I'm curious how you view that. If you like sort of try to peer into the generalized version of what it's like to have symbolic consciousness activated, what's it like? What is that
Mm.
amphitheater?
Yeah, that's a really interesting question. I mean, there's so many facets to it. I do think in many ways there's something really key to meditative practice that is trying to explore specifically that, right? It's like when you first do meditation, almost as far as I know, everyone's experience with that is, oh, my mind, there's so much going on in there. At least that was my experience, the first time I ever did it way back in college, I was like, oh, I can't do this at all. Like it was horrible. And it's actually funny too, because in the research data that I have, the interviews, people, they're asked if they do meditation or whatever, and they'll say, oh no, my mind's too busy for that. And I love how they don't see that, like, that's the whole point. It's like, yes, that's the practice so that, but anyway, so I mentioned that though, because, that's like an initial movement into self-conscious awareness of being in a symbolic world where you're like, oh shit, there's so much going on in my head all the time. And then can I gain a kind of metacognitive control over that, or at least metacognitive awareness of that? Can I still that, whatever? And I think that, then it's like with language, right? It's sort of like you have to have multiple languages before you can get a sense of language. So it's until you can have some relationship with your own engagement with symbolic information processing, you don't really know about symbolic information processing. You're too in the water. So that meditative process of decentering from that to some degree to get a take on it, to feel what it's like to actually have that chatter still and actually live in a human experience that isn't just like in symbolic information processing. All that is like, I think, a really important angle on that question phenomenologically, and opens up all sorts of other, questions too. At the same time, though, this probably won't be a surprise to the audience and people who know my work and know me. And I guess I should just own it. But like, I love symbols. I love words. I love language. I love ideas. Right. And I think that just as sort of like ego gets a really bad rap a lot from spiritual communities to say, oh, you've got to, get rid of the ego. That's just not my spiritual proclivity. I'm really interested in how, words and language and ideas aren't the be all end all necessarily. But we can move through them. We can use them. They aren't just something we want to just quiet and still and get away from. And so I think that I also want to celebrate the symbolic information processing experience. It's a marvel of the evolutionary story. I just did a great conversation with Greg Enriquez and Rob Scott, though, also talking about how, this could be a great capacity, but it also comes with all sorts of inherent limitations and then problems that it introduces, and developing spiritual capacities to navigate those is important. But I think that, becoming meta aware of that phenomenon, that you are an ego, that your ego is telling a story, that we live in a world of concepts. There's a wonderful meme of a little felt mouse, for some reason saying, I am oppressed by concepts. I kind of like that. I'm like, yeah, but you're also liberated by them. So I think it's more complex than a lot of people want to or tend to deal with. And in terms of just a general like science or phenomenological approach that wanted to dive into that, ideally in a non-bullshit kind of way, I think that's great. Whether the Lacanian stuff is it or not, I think that, it's one of the things I'm also trying to do with the research, because it's like, these are things you could measure scientifically, like, in various ways. But obviously there's also this really important phenomenological sense of getting some comfortability with different ways of navigating the human experience that exists because of the overlay of symbolic information processing, right? And so what do we do with that? How do we navigate it optimally and effectively? How do we integrate with our other systems, as a lot of your work is about? How do we transcend it in a healthy way and not a bypassing way? How do we transcend and include rather than transcend and exclude? There's a bunch of that, but multiple different angles on that.
Well, that's great. And we're going to keep this interview short for some special other reasons we're not mentioning. But I really had a great time with this book. There were numerous points where I wanted to stop and appreciate or ponder or mark something in my own thinking. I think it's a terrific introduction to the state of the art in both the analysis of what symbolic consciousness is and the setup to why, from a more academically rigorous point of view, developmental stratification might be a necessary part of that discussion. So I'm looking forward to the future, but this was just a real pleasure for me, this volume. Thank you.
Thank you. Well, thank you very much. I really appreciate that. And in terms of the drug I'm on, it's enthusiasm and energy only. This I think, is the first interview I've done about this book. And as you can imagine, there's a 250 something page or whatever, the long book that I've been marinating and stewing in for a while. And a lot of these ideas are very alive, and I'm excited by them. So I feel energized and activated being able to get into this, and we've just scratched the surface. So would love to talk to anyone out there more about this, and hopefully people will check it out if they're interested in these ideas. But appreciate the opportunity as always, Layman.